My name is Harold Mason. I am 76 years old, a retired high school history teacher, and I live alone in a modest two-bedroom house just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. My days begin early. Not because I'm in a rush to do anything, but because sleep has grown thin in the years since my wife Lorraine passed away. 5 years ago, a quiet stroke took her from me in the middle of the night. No pain, the doctor said, just a sudden flicker of light going out. Like a candle blown by a breath you didn't know was coming. She had always been the morning sun in our house. Coffee brewed with a touch of cinnamon, soft jazz on the radio, humming to herself while watering the succulents lined up along the kitchen windowsill. Now the mornings are silent and sterile, broken only by the groan of the floorboards beneath my slippers and the metallic click of the coffee maker. I still brew it the way she did, even though it never tastes quite right. I live in the same house Lorraine and I bought 42 years ago. It's a humble ranch-style place, is with creaky heating pipes and a backyard filled with memories. A sagging swing set where my daughter Charlotte used to play, the old garden plot that Lorraine kept so meticulously, now overtaken by crabgrass. I've kept most of the furniture the same. It's not nostalgia exactly, more inertia, or perhaps an unspoken fear that if I change too much, it'll feel like admitting she's truly gone. Sometimes I catch myself talking to her picture. Just little things. Lorraine, can you believe the price of milk these days? Or you wouldn't believe what Charlotte said to me last week? No answer ever comes, of course, but the ritual makes the silence feel a little less hollow. Charlotte is my only daughter. She was born when I was 32, after Lorraine and I had all but given up hope of children. She was a miracle then. Dark curls, bright eyes, lungs like a trumpet. I remember the first time I held her in the hospital. Tiny, wrapped like a burrito, her fist gripping the button of my shirt like she'd already claimed me. And claim me she did. I adored her, raised her with patience, tried to give her everything I could. Books, support, a moral compass. Lorraine said I spoiled her, and maybe I did. But when you have one, you pour all your hope into that one. Charlotte married young, 23, to a boy named Neil who worked in logistics. A quiet man, not particularly ambitious, but decent enough. They had a son 2 years later, Kevin, my grandson. My pride, my boy. When Charlotte brought him home from the hospital, I remember cradling that newborn in my arms and whispering promises I meant with all my soul, to be there for him, to guide him, to always protect him. I had dreams, dreams that I'd teach him to ride a bike, that we'd go fishing together on lazy summer mornings, that he'd sit at my kitchen table asking questions about the world, the same way Charlotte once did. For a while, it felt like those dreams were coming true. Kevin was bright, curious, and affectionate as a little boy. He used to run into my house with a shout of "Grandpa" and barrel into my legs like a puppy. We built model airplanes together, baked lopsided cookies, went to minor league baseball games where he'd fall asleep in my lap by the 5th inning. Lorraine adored him, and he doted on her. When she passed, he was 15, just starting to get moody and aloof, like all teenagers. But he cried that night, real tears, and he hugged me tighter than I'd expected. "I'll take care of you now, Grandpa," he said. That moment is burned into my memory. Not because it turned out to be true, but because I believed it was. After Lorraine's death, Charlotte and Kevin became my anchors. Or so I thought. Charlotte would call once a week, sometimes less, and drop by every few Sundays. Kevin was often busy. School, friends, football. But I didn't mind. I remembered what it was like to be a teenager. I tried not to guilt him. Instead, I offered what I could. Rides, a place to nap after practice, the occasional envelope with a $100 bill tucked discreetly inside. He always thanked me, if somewhat distractedly. I figured he'd come around. I told myself, He's a good boy, just growing. When Kevin graduated high school, I helped pay for his car. Not a new one, just a used Honda, reliable and plain. I was proud, told everyone at church that my grandson was going places. He's thinking about business school, I'd say. Smart kid. But after a semester of community college, he dropped out. Said it wasn't for him, that he had bigger ideas. He started selling things online. Sneakers, video game consoles, even baseball cards. Called himself an entrepreneur. I didn't understand it all, but I nodded, asked polite questions, and offered help when he hit tight spots. Charlotte was firm. Dad, don't just give him money. But I did. Quietly. It's what grandparents do. Last Christmas, he came by briefly. No gift, no real conversation. Just a rushed visit between parties. But he did say, "Love you, Grandpa," as he left. And for some reason that warmed me for days. I sat by the fire afterward, sipping spiced cider and thinking, maybe this next year will be better. Maybe we'll reconnect. I even started planning a little summer road trip. Just the two of us, like old times. I never got to suggest it. A few months ago, something strange started happening. I noticed unfamiliar charges on my credit card. Small at first. Gas stations I'd never been to, online subscriptions I didn't recognize. I assumed it was fraud, called the bank, had them reverse the charges, but then came a much larger transaction. A whopping $78,000 at a dealership in Jefferson City. I nearly dropped the phone when I saw it. That's not the kind of mistake a bank makes lightly. My hands were shaking when I called the fraud department. They told me the charge had gone through, that it was a one-time purchase of a vehicle, and that the card was physically swiped, not used online. Whoever did it had been there in person. I froze. Who could have used my card like that? I live alone. I don't share it with anyone. The only people who've ever had access, even remotely, are Charlotte and Kevin. And even then, only for emergencies. A heavy, sinking feeling settled in my gut, one I hadn't felt since the night Lorraine collapsed on the bathroom floor. Something inside me, some old, stubborn piece of my better judgment, knew the truth before I even said it aloud. I called Charlotte immediately. She didn't answer. I tried Kevin next. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. I sat at my kitchen table for hours that day, staring at the statement from the bank, rereading the name of the dealership over and over. My heart pounded like it was trying to escape my chest. And then, with a steadiness I didn't know I still possessed, I got up, put on my coat, and decided to drive down to Jefferson City to see for myself. I wasn't even sure what I would find. A mistake, a misunderstanding, or something else entirely. But I needed answers. And if Kevin really had done what I was starting to suspect, I didn't know what I'd say. I only knew this. The boy I once cradled in the hospital, the one I whispered promises to, had made me feel something I thought I'd never feel about family. Doubt. The drive to Jefferson City took over 3 hours, and I made it in near silence, the radio off. My thoughts cycling through memories and possibilities like an old tape loop refusing to click forward. It was a clear March morning, one of those crisp Midwest days when the sky is a flat porcelain blue and the air smells faintly of thawing earth. I hadn't driven that far in years, not since Lorraine passed, and every mile felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what I suspected grew more physical the closer I got to the truth. I rehearsed possible explanations in my mind, softer truths I hoped to uncover. Maybe Kevin had used my card by accident. Maybe it was for business. Maybe there was some emergency I didn't know about. Maybe. But deep down, Even through the haze of a grandfather's stubborn hope, I knew this wasn't an accident. You don't accidentally spend $78,000. The dealership wasn't hard to find. It was a sleek, modern building with a mirrored front and rows of brightly colored cars, lined up like soldiers waiting for deployment. I parked my old Buick off to the side and sat in the car for a long minute, trying to still the tremble in my hands. I wasn't here to cause a scene. I just wanted information. Answers. Dignity, maybe. Inside, the showroom was pristine and echoey, filled with the sterile smell of rubber and new leather. A young man in a blazer, barely old enough to shave, approached me with a wide, trained smile and asked how he could help. I told him my name and asked if there had been a recent purchase made on a credit card in my name. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of discomfort beneath the gloss of customer service. He asked me to wait a moment and disappeared into a back office. When he returned, he was accompanied by a woman in a red blouse, who introduced herself as the finance manager. She was polite, professional, but there was a tightness around her eyes when she confirmed that, yes, a Dodge Challenger had been purchased 3 days ago with a card belonging to a Mr. Harold Mason. I asked if I could see the paperwork. She hesitated. I showed her my ID. She relented. And then, with the weight of finality, she placed the folder in front of me and opened it to the signature page. There, scrawled in unmistakably youthful loops, was the name Kevin Mason. I stared at it for a long time, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something else, something that made sense. I asked if there had been any co-signer. She shook her head. Full payment by credit card. I asked for a copy. She made one without comment. I asked, my voice shaking slightly now, if the car had already left the lot. She nodded. He picked it up the next morning, she said. Seemed very excited. I stepped outside and leaned against the wall of the building, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't name. Not quite anger, not yet. Not sorrow either. It was more like the ache of an old joint catching a storm, an internal recognition that something you once trusted had turned brittle, dangerous. I looked out at the parking lot, at the sleek rows of machinery, and tried to imagine Kevin walking among them, grinning, posing, sliding behind the wheel with that arrogant, thoughtless ease that only the young possess when they believe the world is still free. I tried to square that image with the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them yellow roses. On impulse, I asked to speak with the sales associate who had handled the transaction. They called him out from the back, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 30s, with a sharp fade and a Rolex he kept adjusting every few minutes. He seemed surprised to see me, but not concerned. When I explained who I was and what had happened, his demeanor grew defensive, then vaguely irritated. "Look, sir," he said, "your grandson came in with confidence. Card matched his name, chip went through, ID looked clean. That's not on us. If you're saying he stole it, well, I'm sorry, but that's between you and him." He paused, then added, "Nice kid, though." Told me his grandpa was rich, said he was helping him get into car flipping. He chuckled, oblivious to the acid boiling in my stomach. Said you'd be proud. I left before I said something I'd regret. The ride home was slower, heavier, a dull ache pounding behind my eyes. I didn't call Charlotte again. Instead, I drove straight to my bank. I sat down with a woman named Carla, who'd been there for years and had handled Lorraine's accounts when she passed. When I told her what had happened, she looked genuinely horrified. She immediately helped me file a formal fraud complaint, and we froze the card. I asked her if there had been any other suspicious activity. She scrolled through the transactions and then turned the screen so I could see purchases from online stores I didn't recognize, recurring charges to a streaming platform I'd never heard of, a $3,200 charge to an electronics store just 2 weeks. Earlier, there was even a wire transfer attempt, $15,000, denied because of verification requirements. Jesus, I muttered. Carla laid a hand gently on mine. Do you want to press charges? She asked. My throat tightened. I couldn't answer. That evening, I sat in my recliner staring at nothing, holding the printed copy of the dealership receipt like a piece of rotten fruit. I kept thinking about the holidays we'd spent together, Kevin's tiny hand in mine as we walked through snow to see Christmas lights, the way he used to draw pictures of Grandpa's house, with my old porch always front and center. I thought about how proud I'd been every time he smiled at me, every time he said, "Love you, Grandpa," in that breezy way teenagers have, as if love were the same as breathing. I felt old. Not the usual stiffness or fogginess, but truly, irreversibly old. Like something inside me had finally cracked and gone to dust. I couldn't understand how it had come to this. What had I missed? What hadn't I taught him? Where had Charlotte gone wrong? Or was it me who went wrong? Giving too much, asking too little, confusing generosity with indulgence. The next day, Charlotte called me back. Her voice was breezy at first, like nothing was wrong. "Dad? Sorry I missed your call. Everything okay?" I didn't answer right away. I just asked, "Did you know Kevin bought a car with my credit card?" Silence. A long one. Then, "Dad? What are you talking about?" I repeated it. Slowly. Clearly. She sighed. "I'm sure there's a mistake. Kevin doesn't even have your card." "He doesn't need it," I said, my voice sharpening. "He's had the number for years, and he used it." I saw the signature, Charlotte. "I've already been to the dealership." Her tone changed then, defensive, tense. "Look, I don't know what Kevin did, but maybe you gave him permission and forgot. You've been a little scattered lately, Dad." That word, scattered, hit me like a slap. I sat up straighter. "Don't do that," I said. "Don't you dare turn this into something about my memory." "I'm not," she replied, a little too quickly. "I'm just saying maybe it was a misunderstanding." He thought I wouldn't notice," I snapped. "He thought I was too old, too stupid, too alone to care." Well, he was wrong. She went quiet. Then, after a moment, she asked, "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer her, because I wasn't sure yet. But one thing I did know, I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. Not again. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling above, while shadows from the streetlight outside danced across the familiar contours of the room. My mind cycled relentlessly through images of Kevin at the dealership, pen in hand, signing my name as if it meant nothing, grinning as he slid into a car I'd never approved, never seen, never even heard about. Lorraine's photo on the nightstand seemed to watch me, silent and disapproving, as if asking why I had let it come to this, why I had handed over so much of myself to people who now saw me as nothing more than a card number and a balance to be tapped. I had raised Charlotte to value honesty, to know right from wrong. I thought I had passed something of that to Kevin, some flicker of conscience, some core of decency. But the silence from both of them since I confronted her over the phone had been louder than any argument. They weren't ashamed. They were preparing. The next morning, I went to my filing cabinet, the one Lorraine insisted I keep organized even after retirement. Inside were all the documents I'd saved over the years: tax returns, pension records, insurance forms, and most importantly, the binder I'd kept for family-related accounts. I opened it with a mounting dread. I found, nestled between 2 statements from a decade ago, an envelope addressed in Kevin's handwriting. It was dated almost a year earlier. Inside, a scribbled note. Grandpa, can you sign this form? It's for school stuff, FAFSA or something. Mom said you wouldn't mind. Attached was a legal-looking document I didn't remember seeing before. A limited power of attorney, granting temporary access to act on my behalf for financial verification purposes. I had signed it, trusting that it was, as Kevin claimed, for school forms. There was no expiration date listed. I sat there, stunned. They had been planning something longer than I thought. At least Kevin had. Possibly with Charlotte's approval. Possibly without it. But the thought that my own grandson had used a legal tool I'd signed in good faith to defraud me sent a cold, sour burn into my gut. I wasn't just angry now. I was humiliated. Played for a fool. I felt the shame of every check I'd written. Every time I'd shrugged off a minor slight or a forgotten birthday. Every moment I'd told myself they loved me. That I mattered. What they saw when they looked at me wasn't a father or a grandfather. It was a bank account in a cardigan. By noon, I'd decided I needed to see Kevin face to face. I had no intention of yelling. I wanted to look him in the eyes and give him one last chance to explain, to apologize, to show even a flicker of remorse. I called his cell again. Voicemail, I called Charlotte. This time she answered. "He's not here," she said flatly. I asked where he was. She hesitated. Out. Out where? I pressed. With friends? I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Tell him if he doesn't call me back by tonight, I'm driving to his place. I have the dealership receipt. I have the power of attorney. I have every transaction he's made." She didn't reply. I hung up. Kevin called me 2 hours later. His voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Hey, Grandpa. Mom said you were worried. Everything okay?" His tone, that breezy, performative innocence, made my skin crawl. I asked him if he had anything to tell me. "About what?" he said. I asked him about the car. Silence. Then, "Oh, yeah, that." "Look, Grandpa, I was going to tell you. I just thought, since you'd already helped with my business before, you wouldn't mind." I gripped the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. "You used my card without my permission, Kevin. You forged my name. You committed fraud." He scoffed. "Come on. It's not like you can't afford it. And it's not like you use the money. You sit in that house doing nothing. I'm building something. I'm trying to start a real life. You said you'd always support me." "Not like this," I said, voice low. "Not like a thief in the night." That's when he snapped. The polite veneer dropped. "You're being dramatic. You're always so dramatic. Mom said you'd make a big deal out of this. You're not dying, Grandpa. You're just bitter because you don't matter anymore, unless someone needs your checkbook." I didn't speak. There was nothing to say to that. "I'll pay you back," he added after a moment. "Eventually." "You'll return the car," I said, "today." He laughed. "I already sold it." The words hit me like a punch. "What?" I flipped it. "Made a little profit. That's what I do now." Buy low, sell high, you should be happy. It's smart. "You flipped a car bought with stolen money," I said slowly, trying to keep from shouting. "That's not business. That's a scam. That's a felony." He hung up on me. I sat in my chair for a long time after that, staring out the window. My neighborhood was quiet. The street lined with bare trees, early spring buds just starting to form. Across the road, Mrs. Keegan was out raking leaves, her little dog waddling behind her. Life continued, as it always did, with the same banal rhythm, indifferent to personal tragedy. But inside I felt something shift. A line had been crossed, and I wouldn't allow it to remain blurred. Kevin had stolen from me. Charlotte had tried to minimize it. Neither had apologized. Neither had shown remorse. They had counted on my silence, on my age, on my love. They had made a mistake. I picked up the phone and called the dealership, asked to speak with the manager. I explained that I was the owner of the card used in the purchase and that I was considering legal action. The woman I'd met the day before remembered me. She said carefully that the vehicle had been sold again already, and they had no obligation to refund or return anything, especially since the cardholder's signature had been approved. But the card was used without permission, I insisted. She suggested I file a police report. It's the only way, Mr. Mason. If the bank finds fraud, and there's a report, you may have recourse. It was the last thing I wanted, to put my own grandson into the hands of the law. But as I sat there, the room growing dimmer with the setting sun, I realized that I had already lost him. Kevin had made his choice. He hadn't even tried to lie well. He had simply assumed I was too tired, too confused, too soft to stop him. I wasn't sure what justice would look like anymore, but I knew silence wasn't it. That night, I gathered every piece of paper I had, the dealership receipt, the credit card statements, the power of attorney, even old texts where Kevin had asked for money to invest. I made copies. I wrote everything down in detail, dates, calls, conversations. Then I got in my car and drove to the precinct. The officer at the front desk, a young woman with tired eyes, took my statement. She didn't raise her eyebrows or express disbelief, just listened, nodded, and typed. "You'd be surprised," she said. "It's always family." As I signed the complaint, my hands shook. Not from age this time, from the enormity of what I was doing. But beneath the fear, there was something else rising in me. Resolve. I wasn't going to be the old man who faded quietly into the background while others fed on his remains. I wasn't going to be the silent victim in someone else's coming-of-age story. Kevin had made me into a mark. But I had not forgotten who I was. I was Harold Mason. And I still had fight in me. The following week passed in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and an overwhelming quiet that wrapped around the house like fog. I had filed the police report, contacted the credit card fraud department, and begun the long, tedious process of disputing the charges. The bank was sympathetic but slow, and every form I filled out, every notarized signature I submitted, felt like a public confession that I, Harold Mason, had failed to protect myself from the people I trusted most. There was something humiliating in the routine of it. Explaining to strangers how my grandson had used my name, how I hadn't noticed until the damage was already done. I kept expecting someone to look at me with pity, to say, "Well, what did you expect, sir? You're old. These things happen." But no one did. Maybe they didn't have to. I heard it anyway. What hurt the most wasn't even the money. It was the silence. Neither Kevin nor Charlotte had called since that last venomous conversation. No apology, no explanation. Just the vacuum of avoidance, as if by ignoring me long enough the whole thing might dissolve on its own. I thought, maybe foolishly, that Charlotte would at least try to smooth things over, to reach out and attempt some kind of reconciliation. But days passed. Then a week. Then 10 days. I saw her name on my caller ID once, but it disappeared before I could answer. I waited for a voicemail that never came. I began to realize that perhaps they weren't just avoiding me. They were preparing. A kind of preparation that suggested calculation rather than guilt. And then, on a Thursday morning, as I was bringing in the mail, I saw an envelope from the county clerk's office. Inside was a legal notice, a petition for guardianship review, filed by my daughter. Charlotte Hollis was requesting that the court evaluate my capacity to manage my own finances, citing recent incidents of confusion and impaired judgment. My hands began to tremble as I read the words again and again. At the bottom, she had listed Kevin as a supporting witness. I sank into the nearest chair and stared out the window for a long time. The robins had returned, pecking through the patchy grass in search of worms, and across the street children laughed as they chased each other past parked cars. Life, once again, unfolding without regard for personal ruin. I sat there clutching the paper, trying to breathe through the slow, creeping horror that was starting to calcify behind my ribs. Charlotte wasn't just turning away from me. She was attempting to take control of everything: my accounts, my assets, my autonomy. And she was using Kevin, the same boy who had stolen from me, as proof that I was no longer competent. The betrayal was so large it almost didn't feel real. This wasn't the Charlotte I remembered. Not the girl who used to fall asleep in my lap during Sunday sermons, who clutched my hand when we crossed the street, who once wept into my chest when her high school boyfriend broke her heart. That girl had vanished. In her place was a woman I didn't recognize, who saw my age as an opportunity, who saw my dignity as a hurdle to be removed. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there, staring at the letter, and felt the floor of my life tilt beneath me. But grief only held me for a moment. Something harder, older, took its place. An instinct for survival. A pulse of defiance buried deep beneath years of quiet patience. I would not allow them to bury me before I was dead. I called my lawyer, a quiet, sharp-minded man named Whitaker, who had once helped me settle Lorraine's estate. He came over the next day, reviewed the letter, and listened without interruption as I explained everything: the credit card, the dealership, the forged power of attorney, the silence, and now this. When I finished, he nodded slowly. The corners of his mouth tightening with anger he didn't voice. "This is predatory," he said finally. "They're building a case for control, but you've acted with clarity and documentation. That's our defense." We began gathering evidence immediately: medical records, bank correspondences, statements from neighbors who saw me gardening, paying bills, walking without assistance. Every scrap of my competence was now a weapon. It felt ridiculous, insulting, but necessary. I scheduled an independent psychiatric evaluation and passed with ease. The doctor, a kind-eyed man in his 40s, asked if I knew why I was there. I handed him the guardianship notice and said, "Because my daughter wants to erase me while I'm still breathing." He didn't laugh. He just nodded and wrote something in his notebook. That night, I didn't sleep again. But this time, I didn't lie in bed staring at the ceiling. I sat at the kitchen table writing a letter, not to Charlotte, not to Kevin, but to Lorraine. I told her everything about the betrayal, the silence, the legal attack. I imagined her sitting across from me, nodding quietly, maybe placing her hand over mine, the way she used to when she knew I was trying not to cry. I told her I was sorry. Sorry I hadn't seen this coming. Sorry I hadn't been stronger when it mattered. And then I promised her something. I promised that I would not go down quietly, that I would defend what we had built together, that I would not let our legacy be rewritten by selfishness and greed. The next morning, I mailed the letter to myself. I didn't know why. I think I just needed proof that I had said it out loud. The court date for the guardianship petition was set 2 weeks from the day I received the notice, and those 14 days passed like a slow strangulation, each morning bringing a fresh layer of indignity and anxiety. The news of the petition had reached a few of my neighbors. One of them had seen Charlotte visiting City Hall. Another had overheard a phone conversation Kevin had at a gas station. Rumors swirled like dead leaves on a forgotten street, and although no one said anything to my face, I could feel the shift. Mrs. Keegan, who used to bring me banana bread on Sundays, now only waved from a distance. Mr. Hollis, I imagined they whispered. Poor old soul. Must be losing it. And still Charlotte did not call. Kevin did not write. There was no attempt to clarify, to justify, to speak to me, like a man whose life they were actively dismantling. I had become a legal inconvenience, a vulnerable asset wrapped in skin and memory. The betrayal hardened something inside me, calcifying what had once been a slow-burning grief into something colder and more strategic. I realized, perhaps for the first time in my life, that I had always been too gentle when it came to my daughter. I'd spent years mistaking fear of conflict for love, retreating behind silence instead of drawing boundaries, writing checks when I should have asked questions. I had made myself easy to exploit, and now that ease had been rebranded by them as weakness. But the mistake was theirs. I was old, yes, but not broken. I was wounded, but not incapacitated. And I was no longer willing to be complicit in my own erasure. Whitaker and I prepared ruthlessly. He pulled public records, found evidence of recent business ventures registered under Kevin's name that were funded suspiciously close to the dates of the fraudulent transactions on my card. He discovered that Charlotte had recently filed a request for a home equity loan, likely anticipating access to my finances as soon as the guardianship was granted. I supplied a list of every favor, every payment, every loan never repaid. We cataloged it all, not out of bitterness, but to construct a timeline, a story framed by legal precedent that revealed what this really was. Not a family in crisis, but a coordinated financial ambush. Still, I wasn't prepared for what came next. One morning, I received an envelope via courier. No return address, but inside was a thick packet of documents, Charlotte's legal brief. I skimmed the contents, my pulse rising with each page. Their lawyer had compiled a dossier of alleged evidence, supporting their claim that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. It included photographs of clutter in my garage, a prescription for blood pressure medication, and, most galling of all, a printed email from Kevin describing how I had forgotten his birthday 2 years in a row, how I had become increasingly irritable and paranoid, and how I once left the stove on all night. Lies, all of it. Twisted fragments of reality stitched together into a grotesque costume meant to make me look like a man teetering on the edge of senility. I read the entire packet twice, then set it down and poured myself a glass of water, hands trembling. Not from age, from rage. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I took out my old journals, decades of entries, neatly dated, carefully preserved. I found passages that detailed conversations with Charlotte, entries about Lorraine's illness, receipts paper-clipped between pages with notes in the margins. Proof. My handwriting was clear, organized, intentional. I brought them all to Whitaker the next morning. He smiled as he flipped through them. "You kept records better than half the attorneys I know," he said. "This is gold." But we still needed something more tangible, something modern. I agreed to undergo a full psychological evaluation by an independent specialist. I met with a doctor 3 times over the course of a week. We talked about my daily routines, my financial habits, my understanding of current events. She administered cognitive tests, memory evaluations, spatial reasoning exercises. I passed them all. At the end of our last session, she asked why I thought my daughter was doing this. I stared at the floor for a long moment before answering. "Because she's afraid," I said. "Not of me, but of life without a net. I was always the net. Now she wants to turn me into a safety deposit box." When the report came back, it was a full-throated declaration of competency. The doctor wrote, "Mr. Mason is alert, articulate, emotionally coherent, and intellectually intact. There is no evidence of diminished capacity or cognitive impairment. His recollection of events, names, and sequences is consistent and verifiable. We submitted the report to the court within the hour. Whitaker made copies and attached supplemental documentation, statements from neighbors attesting to my independence, medical records showing good general health, and affidavits from 2 former colleagues who had lunch with me just a month prior and were willing to swear I was the same Harold Mason they'd known for 40 years. But Charlotte wasn't finished. 3 days before the hearing, I received a visit. Kevin showed up on my porch, unannounced, wearing designer sunglasses and a denim jacket that looked like it cost more than my monthly pension. He knocked twice, then stood there smiling like nothing had happened. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, voice easy. "Can we talk?" I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "Look," he said, "I know things have gotten a little out of hand, but Mom's worried. We just want to make sure you're taken care of." I stared at him, silent. He fidgeted, then continued, "I mean, let's be real. You're not exactly young anymore. And money's complicated. What if something happens? Don't you want to know everything's in good hands?" I finally spoke. "You forged my name. You stole my money. You lied about me in court documents. And now you stand here asking me to trust you?" He shrugged. "It's just paperwork. You'll be fine. We'll get past it." I wanted to believe there was still something left in him worth salvaging. But looking at him then, I saw a stranger, not a lost boy. A man who had made choices. "You flipped that car," I said. He smirked. "Good profit. You used my name to do it." "It was just a tool, Grandpa." "No harm meant." "There's harm, Kevin. You just refuse to feel it." He sighed, exasperated. "Whatever. Look, I came here to offer you something. Mom's willing to drop the guardianship thing if you agree to sign over access to your financial accounts. Joint management. Just to keep things clean." I almost laughed. "So instead of stealing, now you want permission?" He didn't answer. I took a step closer. "Tell your mother I'll see her in court." His face twisted with something. Frustration, disbelief, maybe even fear. But he turned without another word and walked to his car. A new BMW, leased no doubt with money he didn't earn. That evening, I called Whitaker and told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Let's prepare for war." And we did. The day of the hearing arrived under a leaden gray sky that seemed to press low over the rooftops, mirroring the heaviness in my chest as I put on my suit. The same navy blue one I had worn to Lorraine's funeral. Then again at Kevin's high school. Graduation. Back when I still believed there was a through line between sorrow and pride, between the end of one chapter and the hopeful start of another. I checked the mirror, straightened my tie, and for a brief moment saw not an old man, not a victim, but something harder, more resolved. I saw someone who still remembered how to stand his ground. Whitaker picked me up at 10 sharp, and we drove in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic ticking of the turn signal and the distant hum of tires on damp asphalt. He was calm, focused, every page of our documentation neatly tabbed and organized in the black leather binder he carried like a shield. "Today is about clarity," he said at one point. "About cutting through the story they've tried to build around you and showing the court who you really are." I nodded. I had no intention of letting Charlotte or Kevin define me. Not with their words, not with their narratives, not with their hunger masquerading as concern. The courthouse was a modest brick building, familiar and foreign all at once. We passed through security, and as we stepped into the courtroom, I saw them, Charlotte and Kevin, seated on the opposite side, both dressed in carefully curated versions of filial concern. Charlotte wore a muted gray blouse and clutched a folder in her lap like it might shield her from the truth. Kevin sat beside her, legs crossed, his expression carefully bored, as if this were all an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. For a moment, none of us spoke. Our eyes met briefly, and then Charlotte looked away. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement, just distance, sharpened into weaponry. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for bluntness and little tolerance for theatrics, entered promptly. Proceedings began without delay. Charlotte's attorney rose first, laying out their argument in tones laced with false compassion. My supposed forgetfulness, my erratic behavior, the alleged incidents of financial confusion, and above all, their concern for my well-being. She spoke of love, of duty, of wanting to protect an aging father from the complexities of modern finances. But it was all theater, a carefully staged performance, meant to obscure the truth with polished phrases and gentle insinuations. Whitaker waited patiently, letting them finish without interruption. And when he rose, he didn't raise his voice. He simply began to unwind the rope they had tied around my name. He presented the psychiatric evaluations, the testimony from doctors affirming my full cognitive function. He submitted affidavits from neighbors, colleagues, even my old pharmacist, all attesting to my independence and clarity. He read portions of Charlotte's own loan applications, filed weeks before the guardianship request, showing a clear financial motive. Then he turned to Kevin's fraudulent use of my credit card, presenting documentation of the unauthorized transaction, the forged power of attorney, the evidence that the vehicle purchased was sold within days. He paused, then added, "If Mr. Mason were truly unwell, incompetent, then how is it his grandson saw him as a viable business backer, a resource to be used rather than a man to be protected?" Charlotte's lawyer objected. Relevance, tone, insinuation. But the judge overruled. Then they called me to the stand. I stood slowly, my knees stiff but steady, and made my way to the witness box. I was sworn in, and then Whitaker began his questions. Simple, respectful, designed to let me speak plainly. He asked about my daily life, my routines, the management of my home and finances. I answered without hesitation. I spoke about Lorraine, about the promises we had made to each other, that we would grow old with dignity, that we would live without becoming burdens, that we would leave something of value behind. I said, I never thought I'd have to defend my mind to keep my name, but here I am. I told the court about Kevin's visit to my home, the ultimatum he delivered with a grin and a shrug. I said, "They don't think I'm incompetent. They think I'm disposable." When Whitaker was done, Charlotte's lawyer stood. Her voice was gentle, but her questions were designed to confuse, to shake. She asked about minor lapses. Had I ever forgotten to pay a bill? Had I ever mixed up medication doses? I told her no. She asked me what year my wife died. I said, 5 years ago, and I remember every minute of that day. She tried to press further, asking about obscure legal terminology, testing my memory. I answered calmly. And then, just before she finished, she asked if I believed my daughter still loved me. I paused. I believe, I said slowly, that my daughter loves what I gave her. My money, my stability, my silence. But me, the man who raised her, who held her hand on the first day of school, who sat by her bedside when she had the flu, who drove 6 hours in the snow to bring her home from a failed job interview. I'm not sure she remembers that man anymore. There was a silence in the room that stretched thin and tight. The judge called a recess. Whitaker and I sat in the hallway outside, sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups. Neither of us spoke. Across the corridor, Charlotte sat with her head bowed, whispering to Kevin, who looked increasingly agitated. Something was unraveling. When the judge returned, she wasted no time. Her ruling was clear, sharp, and final. The petition for guardianship was denied. There was no evidence of incapacity, no legal grounds for control, and the attempt to gain such control in the face of clear documentation of abuse raised serious ethical concerns. She stated that any further attempts would be viewed as harassment. Then she turned to Charlotte and Kevin and said, "This courtroom is not a venue for family manipulation, nor will I be used to rewrite someone else's narrative for convenience." I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. As I stood to leave, Charlotte brushed past me, her eyes red, her expression unreadable. Kevin didn't look at me, didn't speak, just followed behind her like a shadow fleeing daylight. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. The air was cold but clean, the wind sharp against my skin. I turned to Whitaker and said, "Thank you." He smiled, shook my hand, and said, "You did this, Harold. You stood up. You were heard." That night, I made myself a simple dinner. Roast chicken, rice, green beans the way Lorraine used to make them. I ate slowly, not in sadness, but in reflection. I wasn't victorious. I hadn't won anything in the traditional sense, but I had reclaimed something vital. My voice, my name, my place in the world as something other than a resource to be divided. And as I sat at my table, alone, but no longer silent, I realized that was more than enough. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the world around me settled into a different rhythm. Not quieter, not exactly more peaceful, but clearer. As if someone had washed the windows of my life and I could finally see through all the fingerprints of the past. Charlotte didn't call. Kevin vanished from social media entirely. I'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that he had left town, possibly to rebrand himself in some tech startup on the West Coast, though I suspected that was just a dressed-up way of saying he was running from accountability. I didn't ask around. I didn't need to. Whatever explanations they offered to others would be theirs to manage. I had lived long enough to know that truth, real truth, doesn't require an audience. It simply waits, patient and solid, until everything else collapses around it. There was a moment, 2 Saturdays after the verdict, when I stood in my backyard, boots in the mud, rake in my hand, and looked at the tangled plot where Lorraine used to grow her tomatoes and herbs. For years, I'd let it go wild, letting it become overrun with weeds and creeping roots, as if afraid that reclaiming it would be some act of betrayal. But that morning, I knelt and began to dig. I pulled the weeds, unearthed old, broken garden markers, and turned the soil until it smelled rich and familiar again. There was something oddly sacred in it. The feel of dirt beneath my nails, the slow burn in my thighs and back, the quiet presence of purpose. That's what this was all about in the end. Reclaiming what had been neglected, not just in the ground, but in myself. Later that month, I visited my lawyer again. This time not to defend myself, but to finalize the changes I had decided on with calm, deliberate clarity. The will was rewritten. Kevin was removed entirely. Charlotte's share was placed into a legally binding charitable trust, structured in such a way that she could not alter or dissolve it. My home, my savings, my assets, they were now allocated in ways that reflected not just my legacy, but my values. A portion went to the local library, where Lorraine once volunteered. Another to the Historical Society, where I'd given lectures in my early retirement. And the rest, the largest share, was left to a scholarship fund in Lorraine's name, dedicated to supporting students in financial hardship who had no one else to count on. Not family, not wealth, just potential. That night I walked through the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, straightening picture frames, lighting a single candle by the window the way Lorraine used to. I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was a kind of clean sadness, like rain that finally washes the pollen off the windows. The clarity after a storm you didn't ask for but survived nonetheless. I stood by the window for a long time, the soft flicker of the candle casting faint shadows on the walls, and I let myself miss them. Not who they had become, but who I had believed them to be. I wrote one final letter to Kevin, not to forgive, not to plead, but to speak one last time in a voice he would remember. I told him that love, real love, does not shield you from consequences, that respect must be chosen again and again, even when no one is watching. I told him that he had my silence now, not out of anger, but because I would no longer speak into an echo chamber of entitlement. I signed it the way I used to sign cards when he was little, with care and expectation, Grandpa. I never mailed it. It sits in my desk drawer, under the paper clips and spare keys, folded neatly. Some things are meant to be written, not sent. One morning, just as spring turned the corners of the neighborhood green again, I packed a small suitcase, left a note on the kitchen table for the mailman, and drove south. I took the back roads, stopping in little towns Lorraine and I had once passed through, sleeping in roadside motels with chintzy curtains and terrible coffee. I found a trailer park in Arizona owned by an old friend from the Army, and he let me rent one of the smaller units overlooking the hills. In the evenings, I sit out on the deck, wrapped in a wool sweater, drinking black coffee from a chipped mug, watching the sun fall behind the red rocks in slow, biblical silence. I am not waiting for reconciliation. I am not hoping for redemption. But I am living, on my terms, and that, after everything, is enough.